Well, welcome everyone to the start of our fall literary lecture series hosted by the Antrim Literature Project. For those of you who may have just discovered us online, we are a public humanities platform run mostly by graduate students who just want to share their love and knowledge of literature. Our main goal is to make the study of literature accessible to readers beyond the university, and we're happy to offer this series of free introductory lectures on a variety of literary topics. And you can find all of the past recorded lectures on our database at antrimliteratureproject.org. We should also have the handouts there as well that our speakers have prepared to help you engage in further reading too. I'm delighted to introduce our fifth speaker for the series, Margaret Kearney. Margaret graduated in May with a master's degree in religion and literature from Yale Divinity School. Her research focused on the intersections between Christian theology, teaching and learning, and contemporary novels. Previously, she earned a BA in English from Yale and taught English in New York City high schools for 12 years. So we're both excited and incredibly grateful to have Margaret introduce us to the works of Louise Erdrich, with her talk titled Louise Erdrich's Justice Trilogy. Thanks so much, Margaret. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you're all here, and I'm very excited to be talking with you about Louise Erdrich tonight. I'll start by saying that the topic of this lecture, I think, is always timely, but I think it's a little more timely than I would have liked this week, as I've been preparing the lecture while watching the news coming out of Israel this past week. I keep thinking about how one of the many influences that Erdrich has identified for these novels is America's response to 9/11, and the instinct that she observed even in herself when violence has been done to our community and the people we love, to want to immediately identify a villain and feel this righteous desire for a swift and definitive justice. And Erdrich talks about retribution as a shortcut that bypasses the long, slow, difficult work of true justice. And so with the news from the past week or so, I think it's a great time to take a look at these books. I'll warn you that they don't offer any simple prescriptions or policy recommendations. That's not what fiction does. What they offer is a sustained and honest wrestling with the complexity of living in community with people who have harmed us, and people whom we have harmed, either at the level of our personal relationships, between communities, or even at the national or international level. I think these novels refuse to simplify these conflicts, and that's a gift they can offer us today. And I'll also give my content warning here. These books do deal with serious violence and harms, including sexual assault and lynching. I will not be going into any detail recounting these incidents. We're really talking about their aftermath, but just so you're aware and able to take care of yourself as needed. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to Louise Erdrich. I'm going to give a little bit of background on her life and her literary context. And then I'm going to take us on like a whirlwind tour of these three books called the Justice Trilogy. This is like a much shorter than SparkNotes version that we'll be going through. And we'll do a close reading of at least one passage from each book. And then we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end. So, who is Louise Erdrich? Let me share my screen so we can see her. Okay. Louise Erdrich is a contemporary American novelist and poet. She's a very prolific writer. She's written 19 novels so far, not counting her short stories and her poems. And her work attracts both a wide and adoring readership, and a lot of critical and scholarly attention. She's won almost every major literary award, including the National Book Critics Circle Award, I think more than once, the National Book Award, and the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And for those of you who are not familiar with her writing, she just has a wonderful, rich body of work that I will just scratch the surface of tonight and hopefully inspire you to either seek out her books or revisit them if you have read them. Erdrich is an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians, which is a federally recognized tribe of the Ojibwe people based in North Dakota. And she also has German and French ancestry through her father's side. And much of her writing explores the experiences of Indigenous and settler communities in the Dakotas and the Minnesota area. In terms of her literary context, some of the more frequent comparisons that I've seen are to William Faulkner and Gabriel García Márquez. She's compared to Faulkner, as one critic wrote, because of her complexity of plot, sophistication of language, deft narrative turns, and searching philosophical and ethical conundrums, which I think is pretty accurate. And then another similarity with Faulkner is that she's created this richly imagined fictional county in North Dakota in which many of her books take place, with these complex overlapping family trees and different novels giving us different perspectives on the same setting and the same community. And then she's compared to Garcia Marquez partly because of her use of magical realism. So what I mean by that is that her novels don't have a clear distinction between what we might think of as scientific or historical truth and what we might consider supernatural or folkloric stories. There's a slippery line between history and legend in her novels, both from the characters' perspectives and also from the narrative's perspective when there's an outside narrator. And so things like visions, prophetic dreams, the ability to communicate with spirits and the dead and with animals, these are taken for granted as part of this world and part of the story. So just a little more about her literary context. Erdrich is also seen as one of the most significant writers of what's known as the second wave of the Native American Renaissance. So this is a cultural and literary phenomenon beginning in the 60s and 70s that coincided with a period of renewed political activism, including the broader American civil rights movement and specifically the American Indian movement. So some figures in the first wave of the Native American Renaissance who you might have heard of are N. Scott Momaday, who wrote A House Made of Dawn, Leslie Marmon Silko, who wrote Ceremony, and Joy Harjo, who was a recent U.S. Poet Laureate. And if you have not heard of these writers, I encourage you to check them out. And Louise Erdrich published her first novel in 1984, so she can be considered, a successor or heir to this tradition. And she can also be read more specifically in the context of Ojibwe or Anishinaabe literature. Anishinaabe being the broader cultural group that includes the Ojibwe. And related to that, Erdrich herself cites as her main literary influences the storytelling traditions of her own family. And when you read her books, the influence of the oral tradition is really clear. Not only does she kind of weave legends and stories from the oral tradition into the novels, but the structure of the narratives themselves and the way that the stories overlap, the hero of one story might become the villain of another, or the events that happen in one story ricochet through subsequent generations in another, or you might get contradictory versions of the same event. These are all characteristics of oral storytelling traditions. You can think of any body of oral storytelling that you're familiar with, but especially from what I've researched, this is characteristic of Anishinaabe storytelling, where stories are used as teaching tools and carriers of cultural knowledge, but they're never seen as having a straightforward lesson or message. There's really an understanding that stories can hold the complexities of the community's history and knowledge. And I really believe you can see that in Erdrich's fiction as well. So next question, what is the Justice Trilogy? So this is 3 novels that were written successively, but Erdrich did not originally write them as a trilogy. She's said that she realized somewhere through the second book, The Roundhouse, how connected it was to The Plague of Doves. And in hindsight, they have come to be known as the Justice Trilogy, both because of the interrelatedness of their stories and because of their shared focus on the ways that individuals and communities respond to harm, whether through acts of retribution, resort to legal remedies, or in some cases, acts of restoration or repair. All 3 of these novels take place in and around that same fictional reservation in North Dakota that many of her earlier books also take place in. And they narrate, the lives of this interconnected web of characters and events. So each one is a standalone story and can be read in isolation, and they can be read in any order. But if you read them together, you will pick up on threads that connect them. One of the challenges of giving a talk on these books is they kind of resist summary because there are so many storylines within each book. But I'm going to focus, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on each book begins with a really devastating tragedy that then becomes the inciting incident for many, if not all, of the storylines in the rest of the book. So that's what I'll be focusing on, is that kind of inciting incident and its aftermath in each of the books. And I will also just mention here that kind of in the background of all 3 of these books, and in some cases more in the foreground than in others, are these broader systemic harms that have happened to these indigenous communities. So one of these is the boarding schools. Many of the older characters in all 3 of the novels are traumatized by their boarding school experiences and share or are unable to speak about these experiences with the younger generation, both the physical abuse and neglect, and also the experience of simply being separated from their families and losing access to the language and the knowledge and culture of their ancestors. So that's one of the systemic harms that's in the background of all 3 books. And then the other one is the loss of land. So in the 1800s, the US government, as with many indigenous tribes, took huge portions of Ojibwe land and created reservations with the promise of compensation that was never fulfilled. So this happened decades before the main events of these novels, but it is directly or indirectly tied to the events in all of the books, and again, directly or indirectly mentioned in all 3 of these books. Okay, so that's my very broad overview of what is the Justice Trilogy. So now we begin our very speedy tour through the 3 books. So first up is The Plague of Doves. So get ready for our first heinous tragedy. So on the first page of this book, a white family is murdered in cold blood in a town adjacent to the reservation. And 4 completely uninvolved Ojibwe men are unfairly blamed for the attack, and 3 of them are lynched. So this was in the late 1800s, based on true events, but fictionalized in this story. And the narrative plays out over the course of the 2 generations that follow, as the younger characters hear the stories of these attacks and trace the ways that these events really have shaped their lives and that their effects still ripple through the community. So we're going to look at a passage from Plague of Doves that comes right after one of the narrators, Evelina, who's a young girl at this point, has heard her grandfather tell his version of the murder and the lynching. And she learns that her grandfather, whose name is Musham, was one of the men accused of the murder, but he was the only one who was not lynched because his family is intermarried with one of the families of the lynching party. So in the scene we're about to read, Evelina is kind of putting these pieces together. So let's read the passage. The story Musham, that's her grandfather, told us had its repercussions. The first being that I could not look at anyone in quite the same way anymore. I became obsessed with lineage. I wrote down as much of Musham's story as I could remember. And then the relatives of everyone I knew, parents, grandparents, way on back in time. I traced the blood history of the murders through my classmates and friends until I could draw out elaborate spider webs of lines and intersecting circles. There were a few people, one of them being Corwin Peace, whose chart was so complicated that I erased parts of it until I wore right through the paper. Still, I could not erase the questions underneath. And Musham was no help. He bore interrogation with a vexed wince and silence. I persisted, kept on asking for details, but he answered in evasions to get rid of me. He never spoke with the direct fluidity of that first telling. His medicine bottle, confiscated by our mother, had held whiskey. I never knew from what source. She'd never get him to stop. I still loved Musham, of course, but with this tale, something in my regard of him was disturbed, as if I'd stepped into a clear stream and silt had billowed up around my feet. So in this passage, we can see Evelina trying to put together kind of a family tree / community tree to find out who's responsible for the murder and for the lynchings, and what happened to the people who were responsible and to their descendants. And as you can see, I traced the blood history of the murders through my classmates and friends. She's realizing that in her family tree and in her web of connections in her community, in her own immediate community, there are both people from the lynching party and their descendants and friends and relatives of the Ojibwe men who were killed. And so we get this image of this elaborate spider web of lines and intersecting circles. Which is a great image for both the interconnectedness of this community and also, I think, for the narrative of the entire book and really the entire trilogy, which I'll explain a little bit. So one of the most notable stylistic features of these books is their profusion of narrators and storylines. So this book alone, Plague of Doves, has 6 different sections with different narrators, and within each section, there's embedded stories that other characters have shared, talking about past events or different perspectives on stories we've already heard. So this image of the spider web of lines and intersecting circles can really stand in also for kind of the way that the storylines in the book and in all 3 books can kind of overlap in honestly sometimes confusing ways. And I think the fact that we can have the same image standing for these interconnecting narrative lines and the web of social ties and connections in the community highlights that one of the functions of this narrative strategy is that it really reflects the interconnectedness of the characters' lives and the way that a single harmful event can have these ripple effects in all different directions that then ricochet back and interact with each other. And I think this is really important when considering questions of justice, because especially in Anglo-American thought, when we consider ethical questions related to justice and punishment, we often think of these questions as concerning individuals or clearly separable groups. So if we think about our legal system, we identify perpetrators and villains and victims and act as though those are the only ones who played a role in the harm, and as though they're the only ones who have a stake in its outcome. And the reality is that each party is always embedded in a community that's shaped their actions and that will be affected by whatever remedy or punishment the court imposes. And this is also true in group conflicts. When we try to separate ourselves from another group and label them as other or enemy, and then act as though there's this clean separation between the groups, and that therefore we can keep ourselves safe by punishing or harming the other group, we're really forgetting both about all of the people who have ties to both groups, and can't easily identify with one or the other, and the fact that the groups are ultimately interdependent. So harm to one of the groups inevitably becomes harm to the other. So this kind of interconnected way of looking at both communities and storytelling really throws a wrench in traditional European American understandings of justice. And I think this is one of the resources that these books are offering us. And then I'll just say a few more things about this passage. I love this image of erasing parts of the web and redrawing and erasing it over and over again. I think this kind of speaks to the provisionality of any of the stories or perspectives that are contained within the narrative. When you read this book, every time you kind of feel like you've reached a point of resolution or like just a full understanding of what's happened, there's another angle that shows up and lets us know, we don't have the full story. And I think also this last line offers us another image that, to help us think about this kind of style of narrative, as if I'd stepped into a clear stream and silt had billowed up around my feet. So Evelina here is really invested in creating this map in order to clarify history and to clarify obligations. But the more threads she pulls, the less straightforward things become, right? The waters just keep getting muddier and muddier. So keep this image of silt billowing up in the clear water. As we move on, we're going to talk just about a passage from The Roundhouse next. So The Roundhouse, I warned you, each of these books begins with a scene of horrific violence. So The Roundhouse begins with a 13-year-old boy, that's our narrator Joe, learning that his mother has been brutally sexually assaulted. And this assault takes place right on the border between tribal land, private property, and a state park. So even though tribal law enforcement is able to identify the perpetrator and find evidence to prove that he did it, there's no way to prosecute because it's not clear which jurisdiction the crime falls under. And tribal courts, because of historical precedents, don't have jurisdiction over non-tribal members who commit crimes on their land. And this is a white man who's not a member of the tribe who committed the assault. So there's this reflection throughout the book on the fact that the traditional tribal means of conflict resolution have been outlawed. We get a little window into what some of those look like, but there's no way to rely on them anymore. And then the new legal system, the court system, has absolutely no answer for this horrific assault, as if this woman's suffering doesn't matter. So our narrator, Joe, watches the way that both this assault and the lack of accountability are really eating away at his family. And he hears his grandfather, Musham, telling a story in his sleep that involves an Ojibwe belief, which is in a figure from folklore called a Wendigo, which is an insatiably hungry, cannibalistic spirit that can only consume and can never be satisfied. So we can maybe see a parallel here to kind of the colonizer as Wendigo, who's kind of in this desire to conquer and possess, can never be satisfied. So in the folklore, this figure, the Wendigo, can possess a human, and then that human stops being a human and sees other people as prey. And the tradition says that if this happens and the community comes together and agrees on this, then they kill the Wendigo to protect the community. So understandably, Joe starts to believe that his mother's rapist is a Wendigo. And there's no Wendigo justice at the community level anymore, which is where it's was always supposed to reside. But Joe and his friend end up taking this idea and going off on their own and killing the rapists. And so in the passage that we're going to read, Joe's father he's a judge. And so he has guessed that his son has done this. And he's kind of debriefing this with Joe, letting him know that he's not going to let the justice system know what Joe did and that he understands, but he's also worried about the consequences for Joe. So here's this passage from the Roundhouse. Any judge knows that there are many kinds of justice. For instance, this is the father, the judge, speaking. For instance, ideal justice as opposed to the best we can do justice, which is what we end up with in making so many of our decisions. Lark's killing, that's the assailant, is a wrong thing which serves an ideal justice. It settles a legal enigma. It threads that unfair maze of land title law by which Lark could not be prosecuted. His death was the exit. I would say nothing, do nothing to muddy the resolution. Yet, my father stopped and tried to give me that old look he used to fix on me and others from the bench. I could feel it, but I would not meet his gaze. Yet, he said gently, this too is an abandonment of my own responsibility. That person who killed Lark will live with the human consequences of having taken a life. As I did not kill Lark, but wanted to, I must at least protect the person who took on that task. And I would, even to the extent of attempting to argue a legal precedent. What? Traditional precedent. It could be argued that Lark met the definition of a Wendigo, and that with no other recourse, his killing fulfilled the requirement of a very old law. I looked from one of my parents to the other. Behind them, in the next room, the shelves of old books stood mellow in the dip of shadow at twilight. The scuffed brown leather, Meditations, Plato, the Iliad, Shakespeare in sober dark red, and the essays of Montaigne. I looked at the books as if they could help us, but we had moved way far past books now into the stories Newsham told in his sleep. So again, there's a lot we can say about this passage, but I'm going to focus on just two things. One is the end of this first passage, or first paragraph. I would say nothing, do nothing to muddy the resolution. Right, we can hear this desire for a clean endpoint to the story that has been tormenting this family. The way out of the maze, right? The maze kind of echoes that web and imagery from the Plague of Doves. The perpetrator's killed. Let's close the book on this atrocity. And then, of course, we have this yet, right? So, spoiler alert, this is not the end of the story. These two young boys have taken on a huge weight in carrying out this killing. Joe starts to dream that the spirit of the Wendigo has entered him and starts to see the evil that he was trying to destroy in himself, even in the way he's treating women in the story. And I won't spoil the ending, but there's more tragedy in store for these characters. So the yet is kind of this like one word stand-in for, I would say, both the limitations of this form of justice, and also that, again, the narrative style of these novels, where as soon as we get to the end of one story, there's a yet waiting to complicate it or let us know about unintended consequences or some overlooked perspective. And then I will draw our attention to the last paragraph. So on the shelves, we have these classics of European literature and philosophy. And then we have this, Joe reflecting, but we had moved way far past books now into the stories Musham told in his sleep. So I think that, clearly Joe at this point is feeling like he does not need a philosophical treatise. He needs the wisdom that's contained in a story, and particularly the stories from the oral tradition of his people. But the stories that Musham told in his sleep, I think also points to another possibility that these narratives open up for us. And I'm gonna talk about this more with our last book, La Rose. But I think that in addition to offering us these interconnected web of stories that are really a better representation of kind of the reality of the interconnectedness of our lives, when these sort of material historical realities presents a really bleak picture, as they often do in these texts, and in other situations we can think of, and when they don't seem to hold out the promise of healing, which we really haven't seen yet in The Plague of Doves or in The Roundhouse, narratives can offer the ability to imagine a reality that's different from the one that we currently inhabit, right? This is the realm of visions and dreams. These are the narratives that maybe reach back to the past to look for realities we don't find in the present, or simply use the imagination to come up with other and offer up other possibilities, right? So this brings us to the third book in the trilogy, La Rose. So everyone ready for one last horrific tragedy? This one is rough. So in the first scene of La Rose, a man named Landreau is hunting and accidentally shoots and kills the 5-year-old son of his best friend and brother-in-law. So as you might imagine, both families start to fall apart under the weight of this grief. And interestingly, though, this is the only one of the 3 books where this inciting incident is actually committed by a member of the Ojibwe community. And so what this means is that Landreau has access to the traditions and memories and stories of the Ojibwe people, which provide resources and eventually a vision for healing. Not an uncomplicated or an easy vision, but a vision nonetheless. And it's worth noting that the preservation of this knowledge has been hard fought in Landreau's family. Like I said before, a lot of this knowledge came under attack with the boarding schools and laws against people performing traditional Native religious practices. But we see through the other storylines in La Rose the way that this knowledge has been handed down in the family, even through the generations that went to boarding school and into Landreau's generation, and especially to his son, La Rose, who is only 5, but who loves hanging out with the elders. He likes to go to the elderly home and listen to their stories, and he's inherited this healing knowledge that's been passed down in his family. So the passage that we're going to look at, the first passage we're going to look at, comes from the very beginning of the novel. This is in the days after the accident. Landreau and his wife are just seeking some way forward after what Landreau has done. And they go to speak to the Catholic priest, And then they also take part in a traditional sweat lodge ceremony. So here's that passage. When the air grew thick with steamy heat, La Rose is the one who is responsible for setting up the hot stones and for, that part of the ceremony. So when the air grew thick with steamy heat, La Rose rolled away, lifted the edge of the tarp, and breathed cool air. He slept. The songs became his dreams. His parents sang to the beings they had invited to help them, and they sang to their ancestors, the ones so far back their names were lost. They talked about what they had heard when they fell into a trance, what they had seen when they fasted on a rock cliff. Their son had come out of the clouds asking why he had to wear another boy's clothing. They had seen La Rose floating above the earth. He had put his hand upon their hearts and whispered, "You will live." They knew what to make of those images now. They both knew the stories, the histories. So this vision that they see of their son asking why he had to wear another boy's clothing is pointing to this almost forgotten Ojibwe tradition in which, to make amends for the death of a child, a community member can give one of their own children to that family to take their place. So we might consider this an act of restorative or reparative justice, in contrast to what we've mostly been talking about, which is retributive justice. Retributive justice attempts to balance the harm done to one person with an equivalent harm done to the perpetrator. And we've seen throughout the trilogy that attempts at retributive justice are rarely satisfying, even narratively, and rarely, if ever, lead to healing. So restorative justice attempts to reset balance by repairing the harm with some type of restitution. And of course, this always comes with its own complications, as we'll see in this book. There's no repair for really serious harms. There's no repair for the death of a child. But I think this novel is really committed to representing what restorative justice could look like, how it could play out over the course of years, and how the effect of a restorative act could ripple out in the same way that the other books track how an act of harm can have these rippling effects. So following the vision, Landreau and Emmeline give La Rose, remember this is their 5-year-old son, who was friends with Dusty, the little boy who was killed, to Dusty's family. And this is because, as we see in the passage, they knew the stories, they knew the histories. This is the vision that has been offered to them. And what we see over the course of the novel is that this decision causes a lot of pain to Landreau and Emmeline and their family. It's not a perfect act of restitution, but gradually the families become more and more connected because both families love La Rose so much. So La Rose's birth siblings and his adopted sister become like siblings to each other, and his adopted parents, who go through periods of real rage against Landreau because they believe that his substance use may have been responsible for the accident. And they want to get back at Landreau, and they even make plans to get back at him, but they find themselves unable to hurt him because they aren't willing to hurt the father of their adopted son. So what's interesting about this is that the interconnectedness that we saw earlier in Plague of Doves, in that spider web image and in the muddy waters imagery, that interconnectedness that was making it difficult for Evelina to tease out who is at fault and how to seek justice. Here, instead of kind of like seeking that clear stream, seeking to clearly separate those who have done harm on one side from those who have been harmed on the other, we see the characters really leaning into their connectedness, which can be a source of suffering, but can also offer healing. And what emerges is this imperfect, incomplete, but still very powerful vision of healing. So just to maybe reiterate an argument, I think there's a real parallel between these dense, sometimes confusingly overlapping narrative lines and the realities of life and community. And I think if the books are making any kind of argument, I think it might, or one of them may be that in favor of allowing our narratives to be messy and incomplete and provisional and always tied to other people's narratives. And so to end on a hopeful note, I'm going to read one more passage from the end of La Rose. Again, no spoilers because there's so much that happens over the course of this book that I have not had a chance to mention. But near the end of the book, the family has gathered to celebrate a graduation. And the whole community is there. Both families, extended families, other community members, and even the spirit from La Rose's perspective, as you'll see, the spirits of the dead, whom La Rose has learned to communicate with, including the spirit of little Dusty, who is killed. So this is one of the closing images of the book. There it is. Okay. As he listened, this is La Rose. As he listened, the floating feeling of being with those other people, that's the spirits of the dead, came over La Rose, and he felt them come out of the woods. They wandered up and stood behind him. He felt their sympathy and curiosity. As he felt them move closer, La Rose noticed that the color of the clothing that the living people wore sharpened and brightened. Yet he heard each word that the other people said distinctly, though altogether it was a babble. He watched as they moved together and apart, frowned or laughed, in a dance of ordinary joy that kept moving and vanishing as soon as it happened, and moving again. More of the transparent people came walking out of the trees and stood with the others. Dusty wanted some cake. La Rose told him, "Go ahead," and he walked over and got some cake. Nobody noticed Dusty was there except the dog, and perhaps Dusty's mother, who turned in his direction and smiled in a perplexed way. They being the dead, sat on chairs made of air and fanned their faces with transparent leaves. They spoke in both languages. "We love you. Don't cry. Sorrow eats time. Be patient. Time eats sorrow." So again, many things we could say about this passage. I think this message from the spirits, sorrow eats time, time eats sorrow, is both a lament at how these acts of trauma and violence, take so long to heal from, and also this call to hope because time eats sorrow, because they can eventually heal if we're willing to give the amount of time that's needed. And I think another thing that I'll point out about this passage is that the character of La Rose is a remarkable, and he's not like a unrealistically perfect child character. He does have his moments of being like a little troublemaker. He trains in martial arts because he wants to beat a bunch of kids up. But what's remarkable about this character that we see in this passage is that the way he's always expanding the circle of concern and connection to everyone in his family, to other community members, and even to the dead and ancestors. And I think it's possible to read this restoration of connection, especially to the dead, even in the wake of loss and tragedy, as an attempt to repair the larger harms of the cultural genocide that the policies like boarding schools were really aimed at in their attempts to separate children from their elders and communities from their ancestral traditions. And I'm not saying that this lets the perpetrators off the hook. There's still a lot of concrete reparation that needs to be done. But part of this book's beautiful vision is this representation of a deeply connected community, despite so many attempts to fragment and destroy it. And I think the same could be said again of the narratives in this book. Despite the fragmented nature, we still arrive at the end of the trilogy with this beautiful coming together of many of the storylines that looked like they were separate, completely on different tracks. They sort of tied together. They do tie together in this last book, at least. And okay, so ultimately, I think, one of the things that this book, La Rose, offers is similar to what Landreau's vision offers him, which is this alternate imagination or vision for how we can respond in the aftermath of harm. And this involves leaning into the complexity of our ties to each other and working on strengthening and deepening these ties instead of seeking safety through a clearer separation from those who have hurt us. And I'll close by saying that I think that these books, let me unshare my screen. I'll close by saying that I think these books offer a kind of narrative justice in their representation of these stories of Indigenous communities that have often been erased from our country's narratives. One of the many atrocities that our country has perpetrated against Native communities is the silencing of Indigenous stories and histories and knowledge. So it's a gift to have writers like Louise Erdrich, who are not only sharing Anishinaabe stories, but they're using Anishinaabe storytelling techniques to do so. And they're representing the ethical issues that these stories raise with the complexity and nuance that they deserve. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. A really beautiful talk, which weaved elements of textual close reading with some really moving passages, with attention to imagery and connecting the formal threads across these three novels, especially how these works reinvent forms of communal reading involved in oral literatures. I thought that was particularly interesting. Just showing how the forms of narration are bound up in her idea, it seems, of what you call a long, true justice. We're going to move now into questions and answers. I know many of you probably have questions, so I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you all for watching.